Last Autumn of Khairetdin Bolganbaev. And he had a wonderful dream. Deep, almost tangible clouds and the warm rays of the sun shone down upon an incredible city with peculiar houses, parks and fountains. Contented families stroll down green avenues as students rush to their university classes. A fairy tale city of dreams in which he is remembered. Khairetdin Abdurrahmanovich Bolganbaev belongs to a special group of the Kazakh intelligentsia active in the early 1920s. He was one of the legendary figures who stood at the origins of Kazakh nationhood. The creak of the door as it opened into the cell brought Khairetdin from a wonderful dreamland to the hopelessness of reality. My grandfather already knew that they were to be shot. All our outstanding educators, all of them, were repressed and shot dead. What Khairetdin Bolganbaev really thought and dreamed about in that last autumn is, of course, unknown. In the short but vivid book that is his life, many pages remain empty. The Fourth Estate in the Kazakh steppe. The newspaper entitled The Qazaq had become very popular and was widely read in Kazakh society. A special delegation in Minsk. They knew how to carry out this work in such a way that no one would die in the process. And the fire of love is unquenchable. Khairetdin said to Rahima, "I should not have married you. I have only made your fate more uncertain." The members of Alash Orda at the time of the Great War, the Kokand autonomy, the great power of love, and how did Magjan Jumabayev record his work? Their names brought back to us the last autumn of Khairetdin Bolganbaev. Reflections on History, our version. Chapter 1. Originally from Alash Orda. The first museum for the history of education at the first national university in the capital. Stone chronicles of the great Turks, medieval schools and madrasas, Jangir Khan, Abay, Altinsarin, Alash Orda. His photograph is found amongst them all. Can you see Khairetdin Bolganbaev? One of the leaders of the Alash party, a teacher and a publicist. Khairetdin was born in 1894 here in the Akmola region. He was the eldest child in a poor family. His mother passed away when still young. Khairetdin's father, Abdurrahman, was a pilgrim. He went to Mecca in the 19th century and was a very respected individual. 1909, the Petropavlovsk of his youth. The last warm days before the city plunges into winter with no warning. At the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, Petropavlovsk was an industrial and commercial city. It grew at a great pace. Beautiful two-story wooden merchant houses, churches and mosques were built there. A young man is going to one of the mosques. He had just arrived from Akmolinsk. Khairetdin Bolganbaev entered the local madrasa. A mullah said to his father that his son was too literate, above his age level. He was sent to Kizilzhar, or present-day Petropavlovsk. Before the revolution, there were 9 mosques in Petropavlovsk, 6 stone and 3 wooden ones. Most of them have not survived. No information has been left about where exactly Khairetdin studied. It is only known that he graduated from the madrasa ahead of schedule and that the talented student was sent to Orenburg. And they gave him a scholarship. He studied and lived free of charge in Orenburg in the high spiritual madrasa of the Kusainov brothers. It was a time of studying and endless discussions about the future with fellow students. The pupils of the Orenburg Madrasa were very actively involved in all the political events of those times. And then came his literary debut. I met Dolatov and Baitursinov in 1913 during my stay in Orenburg. when they were publishing the Qazaq newspaper. From the age of 16, every year when I came to Orenburg, I met with them. I considered them the leaders of the Qazaq people. From the interrogation records of Khairetdin Bolganbaev. The newspaper, The Qazaq, was published in Orenburg. It was honest, impartial, and comprehensible to both shepherd and teacher. It was the first nationwide newspaper. None of its predecessors could compare with it either in quality, in the variety of its subjects, and especially its circulation. Its creator, Ahmet Baytursinov, followed certain procedures personally to keep it this way.
Газета «Казах» смогла именно.
The Qazaq was able to identify the main problems within Kazakh society, including those in economic, social, political, and spiritual life. In a short period of time, it became very popular and was widely read in Kazakh society. It was read far beyond the Kazakh steppe. It is said that a ram was even exchanged for the first edition. People quoted its scathing editorials and listened to the authoritative opinion. This was truly the fourth estate, and one which the official authorities did not favor at all. Its circulation escalated at an incredible pace, and devoted readers recognized their favorite authors under any pseudonym.
Подписываться под различными именами.
The tradition of going under a pen name goes back to the 19th century. Many have signed off this way. Alekhan Bukikhanov had a lot of pseudonyms, and one of them was Stepniak Kravchinsky. Bolganbaev's articles were also published under different names, but on equally important topics. Those included issues of land, education, and self-determination. These young people understood that in order for Kazakhs to be equal with the rest of the society, they needed enlightenment and education. Khairetdin was a little over 20. He received a good education, could speak Arabic, Turkish, and Russian. Perhaps that is why, in 1916, and despite his youth, he was sent to the main committee for the supply of the army, the so-called Zemgor. On the recommendation of the editorial office of the Kazakh newspaper, I entered Zemgor. Several others from the young Kazakh intelligentsia came with me. This recommendation seems to have been signed by either Baytursunov or Dulatov. Prior to that, Bukikhanov traveled to Moscow and St. Petersburg to negotiate with the leaders of Zemgor about the recruitment of Kazakh workers. They had made terms to accept workers only on the recommendation of this newspaper. From the interrogation records of Khairetdin Bolganbaev. How did the members of Alash Orda end up in Minsk? Where did they encounter the revolution? And how was independence built? Chapter 2. The Pivotal Years. Along the Khlusov Bridge across Svislach, the river, surrounded in stone and everything around it, bear little resemblance to the views that Khairetdin Bolganbaev observed. Minsk, 1916 to 1917. Translators, instructors, and others who could provide spiritual support went with him to Minsk. It was World War I. The conscription of the Kazakhs into the military caused a wave of protests. The rebellion wasn't so much against the decree itself as against the disorderly methods of the colonial administration on the ground, who were taking a heavy-handed approach in its enforcement. People initially opposed going to the trenches. What is interesting, though, is that the intelligentsia advised against arranging an uprising, believing that it would lead to bloodshed. Bukikhanov succeeded in organizing an interdepartmental meeting because he had widespread connections by that time. He had been elected to the Duma, had joined the Party of Cadets in 1917, and knew Prince Lyov well. The prince later became the head of the interim government and headed the Zemstvo City Union, which was a public organization in charge of all war-related issues. The Alashodar members organized a petition. Here, briefly, are just two of the many points they made. Firstly, the conscription lists had been put together in haste and were outdated, incorrect, and had to be redone. Secondly, Kazakh workers were supposed to be under the jurisdiction of the institutions of Zemgor. Bukikhanov put an entire list of issues forward before a delegation, including the social welfare of those doing military logistics in their places of employment. Alikhan Bukikhanov, Magjan Zhumabayev, and Mirzakib Dolatov proposed that the Russian administration should postpone carrying out this military logistic work so that people could be properly trained and not simply die unnecessarily. September 1916, the first divisions of Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and other Central Asians went to the Western Front. Alash Orda members, including Bolganbaev, were waiting for them in Minsk. They compiled lists of mobilized people, and all this information was then printed in the newspaper, and special escort groups were formed, comprising translators, mullahs, and inspectors. They then monitored the position of fellow countrymen along the entire front line. Minsk is a historical city. Congresses of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party were held here. The wooden building in which they were held has been preserved. Alikhan Bukikhanov was here. Minsk was a very interesting political place. The Alash Orda members delivered humanitarian aid such as food, warm clothes, and footwear to the logisticians. In Minsk, the Kazakh delegation also met the February Revolution. A historical telegram also signed by Khairetdin Bolganbaev. The sun of freedom, equality, and brotherhood has risen for all the peoples of Russia. Our slogan is a democratic republic, and land is to be given to those who derive income from it through cattle farming and agriculture. The most important events in those years unfolded with lightning speed, both in the life of Bolganbaev and in the history of the country. The first and second all-Kazakh congresses took place in Orenburg. The Alash party was created and the Alash autonomy proclaimed. The temporary capital of the new state is Semipalatinsk. The so-called Zarechna settlement on the left coast was renamed to Alash. Here's a plan of the city of Alash, ratified on November 28, 1916. Here are the streets of Alashordinskaya, Bazarnaya, Abaevskaya, Kenisarinskaya, Bazaar Square, and the Black Market. This is, of course, the Irtysh River. The year is 1917. Bolganbaev is a member of the Alash Committee for the Akmola region. And in November of the same year, alongside Muhammadjan Tishinpayev and Mustafa Chokay, he took an active part in the creation of the Turkestan autonomy in Kokand. Mustafa Chokay and Khairetdin Bolganbaev had an ambition to unite the Turkic peoples into a single state, and they officially created an autonomy like this. But of course, it is a fact that they did not recognize Soviet power. What happened next is referred to as the establishment of the first Turkestan autonomy. Historically, it's known as the Kokand autonomy, but this was the Turkestan autonomy created in Kokand. Moreover, it is a common autonomy for all the Turkic people. The Turkestan autonomy refused to recognize the power of the Soviets, and at the beginning of 1918 it was brutally defeated by the Bolsheviks. Bolganbaev was an eyewitness to these tragic events. Those days in the history of Turkestan were written in blood, not ink, he wrote. This Kokand autonomy lasted only 64 days. It can be compared to the Paris Commune, which did not last long either. Bolganbaev's dream, like that of other Alash Orda members, was to establish an independent Kazakh republic on its historical homeland. Even during the Soviet times, under the Siberian Revolutionary Military Council in Omsk, Khairetdin and a group of like-minded people defended the annexation of his native Akmola region to Kazakhstan.
Он один из тех, вот, как вам сказать, вот, деятелей.
He is one of those leaders of the Alash party, the Alash Orda movement, and as a member of the Kazakh national intelligentsia, he made a tremendous contribution to the history of our country.
Очень большой вклад вот, в историю нашей страны.
How did they meet? Why was he sent into exile? And what was his subsequent fate? Chapter 3. An illusory future. For several decades now, they have been recovering the family history. Yellowed photographs, copies of documents, and echoes of family legends. His great-grandfather, the famous Akmola merchant Khalfin, had one of the most beautiful houses in the city, says Jambil Kamelov. Galiaskar was called Kizil Sakal due to his red beard. It was a mark of respect. Thanks to Galiaskar and his brothers back in 1907, the Kazakh newspaper Serke was published with Dulatov's famous address to his compatriots. Those were famous patrons of Akmolinsk. The firefighters were funded here. They had a board of trustees. The Khalfins sent humanitarian aid to the Kazakh logisticians. Bolganbaev escorted caravans on their way to Minsk. Of course, they knew each other. The Alash Orda members were always welcome guests at a Khalfin's home. Here in Akmolinsk, Khairetdin also met his future wife. Our grandmother, Rahima, was the wife of Khairetdin Bolganbaev. Her maiden name was Khalfina. She was from a wealthy family of merchants. Her mother was Mastura, the daughter of Badigul, who was Shokan Valikhanov's younger sister. Shokan Valikhanov's younger sister was a maternal family relation. She was also the great-granddaughter of the famous Khan Tauke. Despite the fact that Bolganbaev did not have such noble roots, no one opposed the happiness of the young couple. He was good-looking, intelligent, wrote poetry, and was a masterful wordsmith. As the famous Magjan Jumabayev used to say, this was Bolganbae. He had no shortcomings. None were equal to him. This was high praise indeed. By 1924, Khairetdin no longer harbors any hopes for a new government. His mind is made up. Bolganbaev and his wife leave for Petropavlovsk. He has 3 children, a comfortable home, and a job as a deputy chief of the Department of Education. But 4 years of happiness ended unexpectedly. For the first time, late at night, he was taken away from his family and arrested. In 1928, Bolganbaev was arrested as a member of a counter-revolutionary organization, which was allegedly preparing the assassination of the secretary of the Kazakhstan Regional Committee, Filip Goloshchekin. The first wave of the 1920s was a time when the cream of our intelligentsia suffered. Exhausting interrogations, uncertainty, and a terrible sentence: execution. I was dissatisfied with the Soviet regime because I did not believe in the establishment of socialism. I did not believe in the longevity of this power and looked at it as a transient, temporary phenomenon. I could not imagine communism in Russia. It seemed to me that today or tomorrow there would be some other form of government. From the interrogation records of Khairetdin Bolganbaev. The new government wasn't recognized and behaved in a dictatorial way. It is not for nothing that we say the dictatorship of the proletariat. Dictatorship certainly implies a lot of human sacrifice. The original verdict was changed, as was still possible at the end of the 1920s. Bolganbaev was sent to a camp for 10 years for his courageous opposition to the course of politics in those times. And she takes the children. Uncle Eric was 5 years old, my mother was 3 years old, That was in 1930. She also had Serik in her arms, who was only 1.5 years old. And then you can imagine what kind of carriages there were in the 1930s. Those carriages were used to transport cattle. They had only benches, no heating, and they went to Moscow and to St. Petersburg. It was a journey of a week or more. It's so hard for me to imagine. This hardest road and 4 years of exile. Their family today see this as an example or even a great act of love. My mother told me there were 9 months of winter and no sun for 10 months. She would also say how everyone would use dog sleds. In 1934, they returned home to Kazakhstan. As a politically distrusted person, Khairetdin was sent to Sari Agash. He was under constant surveillance. He was allowed to work, so he taught the local vocational school. But this feeling of an inevitable repetition of the tragedy never let up. Hundreds and even thousands of Kazakh families lived with those same feelings. Khairetdin said at that time to Rahima, "I shouldn't have married you. I've made your life difficult. Both you and our children are going to suffer because of me." And then, do you know what she said? She said, "No, I'm married because of love, and I cherish that." He was arrested again in April 1937. For several years, Bolganbaev's relatives wrote letters seeking any kind of information about their husband and father. They did not know that 6 months after his arrest, he had been executed. He was tried and the verdict was returned after 3 days. He was sentenced to death. By the decision of the Troika of the NKVD of the Alma-Ata region of November 21st, 1937, he was sentenced to capital punishment, execution. The verdict was carried out on November 23rd. Bolganbaev was one of the active members of the counter-revolutionary Alash Orda organization. From the very first days of the establishment of Soviet power, he embarked on the path of actively fighting against it. Extract from the indictment. How were the memories of those repressed preserved? And what is the location of the monument to the members of Alash Orda? Epilogue: The Guardians of Independence. For many decades, everyone, even the children, were afraid to tell the whole truth about their fathers and grandfathers. The only thing left for them to do was to dream about telling that truth. Most Kazakh families have similar stories. One couldn't say that they were a daughter or a son of a bai, wealthy person, because then one would immediately become an outcast and be ostracized. That is, one would either be exterminated or exiled, or for the rest of their lives they would be destined to bear the cross of being a daughter or son of an enemy of the people. Everything changed after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But very few people managed to preserve their invaluable memories decades later. This makes them 100 times more precious.
Я хорошо это помню. 30 декабря 1997 года трудно об этом говорить.
I remember it well. It was December 30th, 1997. It's hard to talk about it. I saw through the window a postman with a mailbag. After a while, I heard my mother shout, and then her stifled cry. I ran out of the room. My mother was alone, and she said, "Aqtaldi, aqtaldi, aqtaldi," which means acquitted, acquitted, acquitted. Unforgotten heroes whose names have now been cleared. The capital of independent Kazakhstan. A quiet alley is sparkling with golden autumn foliage in the light of the sunset. The rays of the sun, which are rare at this time, embrace 3 bronze figures. Ukhikhanov, Baitursinov, and Dalatov. And behind them are thousands of unseen souls protecting their descendants and the country for whom their lives were sacrificed.